Welcome. My name is Greco. I'm the director of the Museo Egizio, and on behalf of the president, Evelina Cristalen, and of the board of the museum, I would like to welcome you here and to thank you for being here. For us, it's a very important moment, finally, I could say, and I look at the advisory board of the conference, he is all in the front, Paolo Del Vesco, Enrico Ferraris, Maria Elena Colombo. Finally, we're here. We were supposed to have this conference starting in March 2020, then something happened, as you might recall, and has been postponed. But postponing it was quite important for the museum because the museum has been starting thinking what it means to have a digital transition. Since 1 year, we have a digital committee. Enrico Ferrari is the head of the committee and is putting the finger on all our wounds, the understanding how, despite the fact that we have done a lot of digitization, we are still not there yet concerning being in a digital environment and in a digital culture. And if you look at the program of these days and what we are going to discuss together, immaterial, invisible, intangible, decoded, unperceived, unconnected, there are all keywords that are trying to understand very vital problems concerning digitization in a museum, the relationship between material and immaterial, and how a museum that has a material culture can deal with this digital transformation, and how can we have two apparently so different cultures combine themselves and work together. This morning, we will start with a few words that I hope can motivate some questions more than giving answer. Me, Professor Maria Luisa Catoni, Professor Admir Masic, and Professor Willeke Vendrik will try to give some insight of our work. Sometimes it might seem unrelated to the topic, but it's just a start to see how, when we deal with digitization and digital transformation, there are so many issues that come to our mind. Without further ado, I would like to start trying to. I won't tell you till the end, actually, what my lecture is about. You will have to discover, you will have to follow. Because talking about digitization, material and immaterial, I want to bring you to the Valley of the Kings. For those of you who are not Egyptologists, it is the place where the tombs of the New Kingdom, let's say roughly 1550, 1070 BCE, where the kings of Egypt were buried. This tomb, of course, are material tombs. They're made of stones. They are dug into stones, and we could say that the tombs are living agents. They're not just a memorial to the king, but they are transformative to the king himself, and they are vital to the preservation, not only to the transfiguration of the king, but also to the preservation of the spirit of the king on one hand, and of the cosmos of Egypt. I want to show you some example, quoting Van Gennep. When you go through the entrance of the tomb, which you see above there, you go from a preliminal to a post-liminal phase. Actually, death is something that we all have to deal with. Civilization have always asked themselves, how can we deal with death? How can we make the fact that somebody whose cadaver, whose corpse, still resembles the feature of when it was alive, but it does not belong into the community of the living anymore? And how can we make this transition for society, for the livings? And the tomb had these very important issues. But moreover, using a very contemporary word, we could say that the tomb is a metaverse. The tomb brings us to a metaphysical space where space and time of this of the word of the living are not valid anymore, but there are other rules. And immediately we are confronted with that. When you go in the tomb of Tutmosis III, and it starts with the so-called Amduat, the text of what happens in the year after, you find quoted in the upper burial chamber 458 deities that welcome the king. Not only deities, we have also star, the deacons, and then when we enter in the burial chamber, we see there are 3 registers. There are the 12 hours of the night. As Professor Asman said, this is not the liturgical description of what happened, of the prayers that we have to say every hour, but this is the esoteric description. Here is actually explained what happened in the year after and all the hurdles and difficulties that the sun god has to go through in order to come back to life. There are very difficult moments, like in the 5th hours, when he has to go down to the tomb of Sokar. If we go to the tomb of Amenhotep II, which resembles in the kind of decoration the tomb of Tutmosis III, we see some architectural features that are quite interesting. First of all, we see that it has a bent axis. There are 2, there is not one linear axis. And you see that after the first corridor, there is a kind of shaft. This shaft has been object of different interpretation by Egyptologists, whether it was a collector of flash floods, of running water, whether it could be a symbolic interpretation of the tomb of Sokar, or whether it was a mechanism to trick intruders and plunderers that would not go further because they would find themselves in front of the shaft. As always happens, often happens, this tomb is not finished. The upper burial chamber, as you see, is only being carved, the walls has not been prepared, and there is no decoration. But then when you go to the burial chamber, we see again the representation of the Amduat, and look at the ceiling with these wonderful stars around it. And giving the impression actually that the king is living in a different space. The king here with his sarcophagus is in the burial chamber, but doesn't feel the heaviness of the mountain above himself, but is as if he's again traveling in the body of his mother Nut. There are little examples which are very important. When you see the distinction at the upper part of this light, and you see that there is a this kind of decoration, the so-called Keker frieze. This is an architectonical distinction between what is the ceiling and what are the walls. We see in the bark of the solar god, and also the solar god welcomed by different deities, the deity Hathor, the deity of the west, who bring him to the year after. Of course, the sarcophagus at the center of the room has on both sides the representation of 2 female deities, very important. On one side, we have Isis. On the other side, we have Nephthys, and they're both preparing the body of the deceased so that it can be preserved and it can live forever, so that it can be intact. In Book of the Dead, chapter 151, is written, the body has to be vejat, has to be intact, so that the deceased can survive. There is something that I didn't tell you. When we study the tombs, we always try to understand what is the orientation. Is there an orientation east-west? Is there an orientation north-south? Well, I might disappoint you, but when you analyze the tomb on the Valley of the Kings, the absolute orientation doesn't match for most of the time. because the tomb itself becomes a microcosmos. It doesn't matter whether you're pointing to the absolute north, whether you're pointing to the local north. The local north has to do with the fact of the orientation of the Nile, which is 33 degrees move from the absolute north, and the Nile can be seen as a point of reference since it is going from south to north, more or less. But even if, for matter of space, for matter that you couldn't collide with another tomb, a tomb is located in a different way, it doesn't really matter, because inside the tomb is very clear, it's very clear in the definition of the spaces, what is the north, what is the east, what is the west. This text that I showed you, the so-called Amduat, which means what happens in the after, was so important, we cannot, it's not the place to discuss when it was developed, whether it has or not a temple origin, which I do believe, of course, it has. But what is very interesting is that during the New Kingdom, this text was not used by private person. There is only Chai Nefer, first prophet of Amun, in the time of Ramses III, that have large part of the Amduat in his tomb. But actually, it was seen as a taboo because it's not a text. It's not a historical text. It's not like when you are in a Gothic cathedral and you see images of the Exodus resembling something talked about in the biblical text. This very text is, as Professor Hasman says, is the Iket Nunc. Every night there is the cosmographic fight between good and bad, between the sun god and Apophis. When the power of the king in the third intermediate period was not centralized anymore, then we assist to the development of this kind of papyri, where we have exactly the same representation that we had in the tomb, and you see the end of the journey when the scarab through the head of the atmosphere god Shu is pushed through the oriental horizon and comes back to life. There is a development in the royal tombs. So we see, for instance, that after the Amarna period and after, and I don't have time to go into it, the decoration of the tomb of Tutankhamun and Horemheb and Ramses I go back to a more traditional representation. Piankov, who studied these tombs in 1941, said, we are back to tradition. Well, we are not. Because as you see, you don't need to be an Egyptologist, it's a completely different style to start with. But moreover, we don't have here the Amduat. We don't have the book that deals with the 12 hours of the night. We have the so-called Book of the Gates, which has a major difference from a theological point of view. This is the 5th hour of the Book of the Gates with the tribunal of Osiris. And also the architectonical features are different. We don't have a bent axis anymore, but we have one axis, which symbolically means the burial chamber can be in touch with the rays of the sun. This is the burial chamber. You see also here the representation. Actually, there is also major change. You see, this is a gate. The Book of Gates, you have 12 gates that you have to go through, and then you have also in the 6th hour the definition of the 12 hours of the night that are divided by the Mahan snake, which represent eternity. When we look at the decoration of the Book of Gates, it's interesting to see how also foreigners are represented. For the first time in the Book of Gates, in a cosmographic book or thereafter, not only Egyptians are there, but foreigners are welcome as well. So foreigners can have a hereafter. There is a slight difference, but quite interesting. All the foreigners are named by their name, with the exception of the Egyptian, which are called Remech, people, as if they are true people, and the others, well, are admitted. Let's jump a little bit in chronology again, and we go to Seti I, the father of Ramses II, with his beautiful astronomical ceiling. with beautiful Egyptian blue in his burial chamber. The astronomical ceiling, starting with Seti I, find their accomplishment in the tomb of Ramses VI, where we have the Book of the Day and the Book of the Night, where we see the goddess Nut and the sun god, which is swollen by her and travels through the body and is born again in the morning. And to tell you that architecture and text define a different kind of space, that what we see here is not simply a representation, but we are entering, as I said, a metaphysical space where things will happen and transform. We have all kinds of guides. For instance, here we have the Necheru Shetau, the secret gods that bring us, and the gods are located. Here we have the god of the southern sky. Yeah, we have the god that are defined in Apophis and are Emchetvia, which are behind the bark of the sun. Here we have gods that are in front of the bark, and see what has to happen. The king himself has to kill Apophis so that the sun god can come back to life and Egypt can go on living. And here, this was Ramses VI, and this is representation in the tomb of Ramses IX. Let me jump in chronology again, and let me bring you to the 25th dynasty. It's a tomb of Ramose Imi-Per-Hej-Nesut, responsible of the treasure of the king. Is interesting. Is not an Egyptian. It is a Nubian. Is Kushite. And then, for the first time, he uses a text that was never used for a private person. In the center of his burial chamber, there is this important text, which is utterance 368 of the pyramids text, where the goddess Nut is prayed as the one that can defeat the enemies of the king and as the one through which the disease can travel at night. Well, Professor Tefnan says that for Egyptians, words and depictions complement one another. So that actually the Egyptian could write in pictures and depict in words. Why? Well, because the hieroglyphs resemble things, and because we have made a lot of mistakes, we Egyptologists, in the past few years, in approaching philology and the text as if they are detached from iconography. But, I mean, you don't need to be an Egyptologist to understand that you cannot read the text alone when you want to understand this scene, that the two are really part of a unique message that we wanted that they wanted to give. And I show you one typology of coffins, which is called Kerazo coffins, which was developed in the 8th century BCE, where the iconography of the tomb is there one-to-one. This is the coffin of Akhenaten, preserved in Cairo. Look at this sign. The Nefer sign with two wedged eyes is a combination. We read it Neferet, and means the west. So actually there is a clear indication of what we're dealing with. And in the west, we are preparing the body of Osiris. And actually, in the tomb of Mutirdis, we see the scene of the Book of the Day, the Book of the Night, and then Osiris in his abode, and Horus that gives life to him. On the other side of the coffin, we see the re-erection of the jet pillar, which means resurrection. So this is the east, and in the tomb, we find exactly the same. Professor Martin Raven, in a seminal article on the Kerazo coffins, he says how words and iconography determine a magic space where fundamental things have to happen. In the coffin, and Professor van Vansten talked about the architectonization of the coffin, there are a couple of fundamental events that have to take place. First of all, the Stundewaken, the vigil on the body. The body has to be preserved so that the body can, once it's intact, it can be transformed and the deceased can travel with the sun god. This can happen only if there are protected deities that define this sacred space. Once the body is preserved, and he is transformed, the sun god, the deceased can travel in the bark of the sun god. And there is another very important element. You see the Kecker frieze here? It actually separates the wall from the ceiling. Actually, is what Professor van Wansen defined architecturalization of a coffin. Elements of the architecture are put back in the coffin. Why? In this period, we are not decorating tombs anymore. So all the elements that were depicted on the walls had to be transferred on the coffin. In the tomb, the Sejama Hashem said, Mat, those who were working in the place of truth were working in the tomb, were divided into sets, the left team and right team. And as we can see in one of the most important papyri that we have here in the museum, there is a plan and a section of the tomb of Ramses IV, and I thank Professor Corina Rossi for the animation of this papyrus. Actually, it's a very important piece that we have in the museum. It's not a project. It's done once the tomb was completed, where we have the designation of every single place. We see the gates, we see how the place is in a hieratic is described, how the single parts of the tomb were used, and what was the role. Here we see confirmed once more that the microcosmos of the tomb is something not that we have to interpret symbolically, because the text tells us what is there and how this different architectonical space become places where transformation can take place, where the king can become Ach, and where the not only the resurrection of the king, but the preservation, as I said before, of Egypt can take place. It's also quite painful for us to read these texts, because we see how much we have lost. Because in these different texts is also written where the treasures was, where the funerary statues were, and where all the golden burial goods were, which unfortunately have been plundered. But even here, I'll come back in a moment. If we look at the center, there is, of course, the most important piece. There is the body of the deceased, and the body is inside a sarcophagus. And it was quite interesting because this papyrus was published in 1917 by Sir Alan Gardiner and Howard Carter, and nobody understood what they saw there, because they thought that these places surrounding the coffins were kind of stairs, indicating stairs going down. They couldn't know that these were now chapels, golden chapels, which were containing one in each other, and was Howard Carter in 1922 to understand that. But what I want to show you, what we wanted to show with this animation of the papyrus, is how, if we put all this information together and we take the information that we have from the Theban mapping project, actually how we can go through the journey that the disease is doing in the tomb after the entering, with the text on both sides, which were put by the men who were working there, the artists and artisans from Deir Medina, how the different parts of the tomb was decorated, how in the burial chamber we have the Book of Gates, with a scene that we already seen with the gates clearly indicated here, and on the ceiling we have the Book of Nut, of the goddess Nut, who is responsible for the transformation. The orientation, even if it's not the exact orientation, is aimed at delivering a very important message, that actually with the solarization of the king, at the end of this process, the king himself, after defeating Apopis, will live again. Achet, this is the horizon, and the tomb itself is called the Achet, the horizon of Ra. Here again, the symbolic value of a tomb that becomes something else, the place where the horizon is there. And actually, when the sun sets again in the east, comes again back on Earth in the east, the solarization is complete and Apophis is defeated. But it's not something that happens once. Professor Hausmann is very clear. Every night, this cosmographic battle between good and bad can take place. So, why have I showed you that? You might wonder. I'm in the wrong Congress? Well, no. We are talking about immateriality. We are talking about digitizing as if it's something very new in our discipline. We set the beginning of Egyptologies in 1822, when for the first time the texts were deciphered by Jean-François Champollion. And if there is something that we all think belongs to our imagination of Egyptology, is the overwhelming presence of objects, overwhelming presence of monuments, overwhelming presence of objects. But what do we do in a museum? Do we do what Ali Sherry here says, is a Franco-Lebanese artist who has exhibited this work here in the museum. He called it Fragments 2, where there are objects coming from Syria, from the Levant, from Greece, from Egypt, from Indonesia and Peru, and then there is this pharaoh eagle hovering over the objects. And actually what Ali Sherry says, well, the objects are deprived of their context. They're killed in the museum because they don't have their context. But how do you create a context? Is that tangible? Is material? Or isn't it the museum the place where since the very beginning, actually, we are not concentrating, despite what we say, at all on the materiality, that the object becomes a pars pro toto. How many of us, when we go in a museum, think about what a mummy is? Or isn't a mummy just a way to explain the beliefs in the year after? How much do we concentrate on the materiality of the coffin? How much do we write about what is the wood which a coffin was made of? And how much do we show this not only to be an element of explaining the production, explaining the technology, but just to dive into materiality. I'm showing you some pictures of the so-called galleries of the material culture that we have in the museum, that we are developing more and more with the aim of taking out the materials from our reserves. You have to imagine that only in this corridor we have 11,000 objects, and actually what we want to convey is the massality, the materiality, the production, all the vases we have, and we will do more because we are planning a room where we'll exhibit 8,000 vases in the near future. And when we go to text, how much are we interested in the material? We say always the time we talk about material culture, but how much do we think that the fibers, the value of the papyrus is important, and how much we still think that the text is the only thing is related? I still belong to a generation that when we were studying a coffin, nobody would even tell us what a coffin was made of. The coffin was important because there were certain chapters of the Book of the Dead, because there were certain representations, certain iconography. So how truly do we work in text content, scribal practice, but material features? And how new technologies could help us? When we have 17,000 fragments of unpublished papyri, where even the definition of the papyri themselves could help us in reconstructing corpora. Egyptology has also this kind of, let's say, contradiction. On one hand, the overwhelming presence of objects. On the other hand, and I gave you a small example, the symbolic interpretation which we have to deal with. And as if, and here there is a very important risk, which is the risk of over-interpretation, but in the same time are we not considering the value of the objects that actually can become transparent if they're not considering their materiality, and they are pushed down by different epistemologies that try to understand the hidden meaning of the object. And I was quoting here Olsen 2010 about the contradiction of archaeology and the contradiction of the fact that we archaeologists say, well, we deal with material culture, we deal with objects, but actually we treat them as little fragments in order to create narratives. And I give you another example, because there is no Egyptology without Tutankhamun. How many of us remain speechless in front of the mask, but how many of us remember that on the 11th of November 1925, as Christina Ricks described very carefully in a very recent book, Tutankhamun was unwrapped, and then it had to be taken out of the mask, because the mask was actually glued by this resin to the bottom of the coffin. It was even beheaded. And so how can we interact? I don't have an answer. That's why we have a conference here, because otherwise we didn't need you to come here and help us in giving an answer. I just can give you an example of what we have done a few years ago with Invisible Archaeology, as we call this exhibition, which was a way actually to go inside the materiality, to describe the biography of the object, to find a way to bring the objects alive within the landscape they come from, to deal with ethical problems. What are human remains? How can we deal with the unwrapping, even realtor unwrapping of the remains? How can we show something that is not visible but is inside a mummy, still unwrapped? How can we treat not only human remains but also animal remains, and is it ethical to unwrap them? And how can we deal with the materiality? How can we talk to and show to our visitors what are the material, and also what it meant to choose a material instead of another? How in studying the material, for instance, the ink, we can distinguish workshops. How we can see that some papyri were restored, filling the gaps with part of previous papyrus. And so this was a first attempt to understand how material and immaterial can live together. Actually, this exhibition that seems very immaterial was very material, because having a narrative, digital narrative, was forcing to look at the materiality. And for the first time, we were not interested anymore about symbolism, about religion, about what the texts say, but how the objects were made. So how are we dealing here with a contradiction in materiality, something material that can make us think about the materiality? Is so digital so different for what we have been doing in museum since the beginning of museums? So in the museum we are telling stories actually and neglecting the objects. And paradoxically, would the digitization help us finally to understand material and put material at the center of our narrative and not neglect the objects, as probably we have been doing in the past 200 years in our discipline, because the objects are just these fragments, the pars pro toto, from which we try to reconstruct a past. Because at the end of the day, we might ask ourselves, what are we really interested in? Are we really interested in the materiality, or we are trying to reconstruct how ancient Egyptians, in this case, lived, thought, feared, and did express rituals? When we excavate a tomb, are we interested in the materiality of the tomb, or we are more interested in the functionality and trying to understand all the rituals of which we know very little about that were performed when the tomb was set down. And I said the tomb was a living agent. It was indeed. The tomb even had a ritual of the opening of the mouth. So it was a living agent. And so how can we grasp this immateriality, of which we know very little about? Maybe put it at the center of our discourse, the material culture. Thank you.